Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and this is the review for Chapter 5 Tests, Diffusions, and Interactions. And this is called 570T. It's extra credit. And this won't take long. We're going to go through this. I'll discuss the answers, and we'll just go through this real fast. First of all, the time frame. Let's talk about this period for a second. Ancient history is over. We're in the Middle Ages, and this period is between that classical period of antiquity when Rome was alive to the modern age. It's in between those two. You can call it the post-classical period. You can call it the Middle Ages. You can call it the Dark Ages. You can call it the medieval period. It's all basically different names for the same time period, and it basically lasts from the fall of Rome up to the Renaissance, which we'll be studying very soon. So what is that basic time frame in terms of years? We're talking about approximately, let's just say, about 600 AD to about 1450 AD. And the name of the game is trade. Trade is what it's all about. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again here. What got us out of the Middle Ages? You could chalk it up to a lot of different things. The Crusades, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, the Great Schism. You could chalk it up to other things as well, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance. But no matter what you do, it all goes back to one common denominator, and that is trade. And I've said a million times, if you don't have trade, you don't have anything. Literally nothing is going on. And so let's begin with this medieval trade. We began this unit talking about Africa, and particularly East Africa and West Africa, and they were quite a bit different. So what were two early East African trading kingdoms that we studied? We studied very briefly Kush and Axum. And what was the notable thing about each one of them? Kush was influenced by the Egyptian culture, and Axum was actually the first Christian kingdom in Africa. So that's what made the two of those distinct from each other. And then how did Islam spread to East Africa? Arab traders on that Indian Ocean trade network spread Islam along the East African coast as they traded, set up cities and trading centers, and their religion went with them. What was mostly traded in each direction? Well, coming out of Africa, what was leaving Africa were things like ivory, slaves, gold. Those were big commodities that went out into the Indian Ocean trade network from Africa. Going the other way, you had spices, silk, and other Asian goods that went into East Africa from the Indian Ocean. So that's really all we need about East Africa for this test. And then so we can move on to West Africa. Very different. West Africa was isolated from North Africa by the Sahara Desert. And Muslim merchants would actually trek through that desert along the gold salt trade route. That's another one of our big three trade routes: Indian Ocean Trade Network, Gold Salt Trade Route, and the Silk Road. But nevertheless, Ghana, which was a trading kingdom that sprung up in West Africa, that was actually not an Islamic kingdom like the others that we see coming up later than Ghana. King Sundiata Keita, who ruled from 1214 to 1255, founded the Mali kingdom, and he also converted to Islam in order to win approval of Muslim traders. And he participated in the traditional African religious practices of his people as well as Islam. So what were major items that were traded in these West African trading kingdoms? You had gold from West Africa, and you also traded salt. Salt was very necessary for survival. And there were many other things that were traded as well. But gold and salt, those are the highest two. We've got this question: who was Mansa Musa? And I don't see it on here, but let's just talk about Mansa Musa just in case we need anything about Mansa Musa. He lived from 1280 to 1337. He was a king of Mali. He was a devout Muslim. He spread Islam throughout West Africa. He was the richest person who ever lived. And in 1324, Mansa Musa took a huge entourage across Africa to the holy city of Mecca in Arabia. When he took the Hajj, remember that Hajj, that pilgrimage to the city of Mecca, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that every Muslim is obligated to do once in his or her life. And along the way, he spent so much gold because he was so rich that he inflated the economies of every city he went to. And so that's just some information about Mansa Musa that we want to keep in mind. What were 3 West African trading kingdoms that benefited from that gold salt trade? You have got Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai, all of which were heavily involved in this trade route and became very wealthy because of it. Sub-Saharan Africa, who gradually settled this part of Africa over a period of centuries. So we're talking about not just West Africa, but all of Africa going down to the very southernmost part of it. And that would be the Bantu peoples that migrated out of Central Africa and to the south. What was the most important difference between them and the peoples of East Africa and West Africa? These people were not exposed to Islam until much later because dense vegetation served as a barrier to the spread of Islam from West Africa or from East Africa to them. And that's really all we need to know about Africa. The Silk Road. The Silk Road is a prominent feature of this particular unit. And so the Silk Road, like I said, very important. What were 3 kinds of things that traveled along the Silk Road? You had luxury goods, of course, such as silk, many other luxury goods as well, whatever a camel could carry relatively cheaply. You also had cultural ideas that spread, such as Buddhism. And of course, you had diseases that spread, such as the Black Death. And you also had technology, such as the compass and gunpowder that traveled along the Silk Road. So what were 2 civilizations that the Silk Road connected? And this is kind of going back into that classical period, but very early, the Silk Road connected the Roman Empire to the Han Dynasty in China and contributed to Rome's trade deficits actually, and contributed to Rome's economic downfall. So that brings us to the Crusades. We did not do much on the Crusades, but here are the highlights of what we did talk about with regard to the Crusades. What was the purpose of the Crusades? The purpose of the Crusades was, for one thing, there were multiple purposes, but for one thing, to reclaim the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, from the Muslims and set up Christian kingdoms there. What was the personal goal of many of those crusaders? And we talked about that. The personal goal for many of them was redemption from sins and to gain eternal salvation because they were obeying, in their minds, they were doing what God willed them to do by making this pilgrimage to the Holy Land and taking part in this reconquest of the Holy Land on the part of Christianity. So what was the long-term impact of the Crusades on both Europe and the Middle East? Well, Europeans were introduced to new ideas and products which stimulated trade between the Middle East and Europe. That stimulated both commerce and banking, and it contributed to the growth of towns and the need for education, all of which served to undermine the feudal system that we studied so extensively, because the feudal system was not designed to support those kinds of activities. We also did a reading on the three great Islamic empires of the Middle Ages. Remember, we had the Ottomans, we had the Safavids, and we had the Mughals. And how did the Ottomans deal with non-Muslim communities in their empire? The Ottomans were an Islamic community, but they had many communities within their territory that were not Muslims. And so non-Muslims such as Jews and Christians lived in their own communities, and these communities were called millets. And these millets ran their own affairs. They collected their own taxes. These communities also often had to pay a special poll tax specified in the Quran called the jizya. And the purpose of these millets was that it served to reduce friction between these communities and the Ottoman state. What was the biggest difference between the Safavid Persian Empire and the other two great Islamic empires of the Middle Ages, the Mughals and the Ottomans? Unlike the Ottomans in Anatolia, and Anatolia is just an ancient name for Turkey, and unlike the Mughals in northern India, the Safavid Persians were Shiite Muslims. The modern country of Iran, which is where the Safavid Persians were based, is still mainly Shiite to this day. What was unique about the Mughal Empire while Akbar the Great was running it? Akbar the Great was extremely tolerant of Hindu and Buddhist religions, even ending the jizya and even promoting Hindu people to his government. Both of these practices were very much against Islamic tradition. So how did this change when Akbar's grandson Shah Jahan became Sultan? Shah Jahan went back to tradition. He went back to the fundamentals of Islam. He got back to the basics, you might say. And he reinstated the jizya, and he also had many Hindu temples torn down. And in the process, many Hindus actually converted to Islam. We also studied the Mongols. What were the reasons for the explosive success of the Mongol Empire? Remember that the Mongols displayed great skill in the use of horses and arrows. It made them very, very successful militarily. They made a very effective use of fear and terror, but they were also religiously and culturally tolerant. Let's not forget, they conquered Muslim kingdoms in the western part of their empire and then voluntarily converted to Islam. They weren't forced to convert, they chose to convert. And then who founded the Mongol Empire? This is one of two names you should know. Genghis Khan. Keep in mind that Genghis Khan's grandson was actually Kublai Khan, who became the first foreign emperor of China. So how much territory did the Mongol Empire cover? They covered all of Central Asia, all the way from China in the east to Russia in the west. Massive empire, much bigger than the continental United States. So what impact did the Mongol Empire have specifically on China over in the eastern part of this massive empire that they had? And by the way, keep in mind, just three things to keep in mind with regard to this massive Mongol Empire that covered so much of Asia. Keep this map in your head, if you will. In the east of it, there's China. They rule China. In the west, there's Russia, and they rule that. And then going back and forth throughout their empire, from east to west, is that Silk Road trading network that they take great pains to protect, because that network is making them a lot of money. And so the impact that they had on China was this. They united northern China and southern China. They placed their own ruling dynasty upon China, the Huan dynasty. That's a foreign dynasty because the Huan dynasty, they're not Chinese, they're Mongols. And they also encouraged Chinese commerce and trade, of course, because uh, they knew it was worth a lot of money to them. And they were so interested in China and developing China's commerce that they actually moved their capital to China. So, what impact did the Mongol Empire have on Russia? We really didn't study Russia, but just in case you might need something about it, keep in mind that they isolated most of these Eastern Slavs, and those were Russian, from other European nations, other European civilizations out in Western Europe. Mongol words and Mongol customs, Mongol clothing, Mongol administrative practices all found their way into the Russian culture because they ruled Russia for 2 centuries, 200 years. Talking about the end of the Middle Ages, and we talked about these things a bit, we're coming back to the Crusades. Europeans were introduced, like I said before, to new ideas, new products, and that stimulated trade between the Middle East and Europe, stimulated commerce and banking, contributed to the growth of towns, contributed to the need for education, and hence the emergence of such things as universities. All of these things served to undermine that localized, land-based feudal system, which was not designed to support non-agricultural environments. The Black Death, we talked about that quite a bit. The Black Death reduced the population. This is how it kind of started to bring the Middle Ages to a close, especially bringing feudalism to a close. The Black Death reduced the population of Europe by between a third and a half, and it caused a severe labor shortage. And this gave serfs and urban laborers more bargaining power because their labor was worth more now. And they could demand higher wages and better work arrangements. And this undermined that serf system in Western Europe. Now, we didn't really talk at all about religious crisis or what we call the Great Western Schism, not to be confused with that schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church that we talked about in 1054. This is a different schism. But just to give you a quick rundown, the Church, as we have seen, had been a powerful unifying force and a powerful political authority in the Middle Ages. Church crises, such as an event called the Babylonian Captivity and another event that was related called the Great Western Schism, caused people to doubt the church's legitimacy and authority. And another thing that caused people to doubt the church's legitimacy and authority was the Black Death, because the church is supposed to have this connection to God. The church is supposed to be able to call upon God to fix things and heal people and make things better. And when the Black Death hit, the church couldn't do that. And that seriously damaged the Catholic Church's credibility in the minds of the survivors. And then finally, you had the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War introduced new weapons, such as the longbow and artillery. And these weapons made common people more effective on the battlefield and gave them the ability to challenge the military dominance of knights and castles, two big important elements of the feudal system. So if knights and castles can be challenged, that's going to undermine that entire feudal system. The longbow, for example, could penetrate a knight's armor, and artillery could knock down a noble lord's castle. So this undermined all of feudal society. Just these weapons turned all of society on its head, because that society, feudalism, which was a main feature of the Middle Ages, depended on the military dominance of those knights and those castles. All right, so that's all you're going to need for this test. Take down the notes that you feel are the most important thing. Write down key words, key phrases, study them well, and you should do great on the test. Bye.